I was good at school, but I preferred to be outside, learning by being in nature. And my mother supported this love of animals. So she came in one day when I was 1.5, and I'd taken a whole handful of earthworms to bed with me. And she said, Jane, yes, she said, you were watching them so intently, I thought maybe you were wondering, how do they walk without legs? And she didn't get mad at me, bed full of earth. She just said, they'll die, we better take them out. So, and then a story which I love, and some of you, I'm sure, have heard it, but I tell it for a reason. And Mum took me when I was 4.5 for a holiday in the country onto a farm, proper farm, animals out in the fields, none of these terrible intensive factory farms. And I was given a job to collect the hens' eggs. So there were about 6 wooden hen houses where they slept at night, and I would open the boxes around the edge and pop the eggs in my basket. But apparently I began asking everybody, but I can't see the hole where the egg comes out. And nobody satisfied my curiosity. So what I do remember is seeing a hen going into one of these hen houses, and I must have thought, she's going to lay an egg, so I crawled after her. Squawks of, I suppose, fear, she flew out. And in my little 4-year-old mind, I must have thought, well, no hen will lay an egg here. It's a frightening place. But, you know, then I'm on the road to discovery. So I went into an empty hen house. And apparently I was gone for 4 whole hours waiting for a hen to come in. And I distinctly remember the hen came in, she was brown, and I watched the egg come out. Wow. And by this time, it was getting towards evening. My mother had actually called the police. And yet, when she saw this little girl running towards the house, instead of grabbing me, how dare you go off without telling us, don't you dare do it again, which would have killed the excitement, she sat down to hear the magical story of how a hen lays an egg. So the reason I tell that, isn't that the making of a little scientist? Curiosity, asking questions, not getting satisfied, deciding you can find out for yourself, making a mistake, not giving up, and learning patience. It was all there. And a different kind of mother might have crushed that early curiosity, and I might not have done what I've done. So because there was no TV, I learned from books. And Mum found books about animals, thinking I'd learn to read more quickly. So I met Dr. Dolittle when I was 8. Surely some of you have read about Dr. Dolittle. And then when I was 10, by this time war was raging. Books, we didn't have much, we had very little money. And books came from the library, but I found this little second-hand bookshop. And I used to spend a lot of every weekend there and save up all my tiny pennies of pocket money. My sister immediately bought sweets and ate them, I saved them. And on this occasion I had just enough money to buy this little book. And I took it home and read it. And that was called Tarzan of the Apes. So of course I fell passionately in love with this glorious Lord of the Jungle. And what did Tarzan do? He married the wrong Jane. So that was when my dream began. I will grow up, go to Africa, live with wild animals and write books about them.
Right, so you're passionate, and you had a sense that you would do that right from that early age.
But not chimpanzees, just Africa and animals. And if I couldn't do Africa, I thought about Canada and wolves at one time.
Right,
after reading Jack London, The Cry of the Wolf. But, you know, I did very well at school, but we couldn't afford university. So I had to do a boring secretarial course in London. Got a job, I had to have a job. And then came a letter from a school friend inviting me to Kenya. Opportunity. You see, when I dreamt of Africa, everybody laughed at me. How will you get to Africa? That you don't have any money. There's a war. Africa's far away. And you're just a girl. Dream about something you can achieve. Women weren't scientists like that in those days. But Mum said, if you really want this thing, then you're going to have to work really hard, take advantage of opportunity, but don't give up. And that's the message I've taken to children, particularly in disadvantaged communities. And I just wish Mum was alive to see how many people have written to me, come up to me and said, Jane, I want to thank you because you've taught me. Because you did it, I can do it too. And that's what you just said.
Totally. I mean, I totally can thank you 100% for Maybe
Thank my mum.
Thank your mother, exactly,
Yes.
and my mother who gave me the book. So, and likewise, I had a mother that was always encouraged me to do what I follow my dreams and my passions. And I think with you, you've got an unusual power of observation, which goes back to watching the chicken lay the eggs. Everyone's fascinated by chicken laying eggs, but they haven't sat there watching underneath as they do it.
Waiting
Spent 4
for
hours
4 hours, waiting
for
for
it
a
to happen.
hen.
So you've got this very passionate and powerful power of observation, and I'm sure your time in Gombe, that's what led you to some of these really incredible observations. And the observations are simple, really, when you think about them, but no one had seen these observations. And the scientists of the time were male, predominantly, and they were probably looking for different things too, don't you think? Do you think as a female that you maybe were open to...
Leakey chose me because, I was a woman and he felt women might be more patient and better observers. Also because I hadn't been to college and I didn't have a mind cluttered up with the reductionist scientific thinking of the day. And so when I got to Gombe, the first problem was the chimps took one look and ran away. And, I only had money for 6 months. Imagine who was going to give money to this young, untrained girl.
Yeah.
But finally it was a rich American businessman who said to Lewis, all right, half a year, 6 months. And weeks turned to months, and still the chimps were running away. And I was getting more and more desperate because I knew I couldn't find out anything until the chimps accepted me and I could be close, like I'd been with the animals around home in Bournemouth. And fortunately, just 4.5 months into the study, I saw that never to be forgotten sight of David Greybeard, the first chimp who began to lose his fear. And he was about as far away as the door there, right down there. But through my binoculars, I could see him break off grass stems and use them to fish for termites, and break off leafy twigs. And he had to remove the leaves to make a tool.
Yeah.
And at that time, it was thought humans and only humans used and made tools. At least science thought that.
Yes.
If you'd bothered to go and ask the pygmies in the forest, they could have told you.
Of course, and that's the power of indigenous people
yes.
in all these forests and communities. And that's it was such a big deal at the time because...
because it brought in the National Geographic,
Yeah.
and they sent a photographer,
Yeah.
Hugo van Lauwijk, who I know some of you saw the recent Geographic, Jane, and that was Hugo's film. So when the scientists refused to believe the tool using, they said, well, she's just a girl, she doesn't have a degree.
Yeah,
But when
what does she
Hugo's
mean?
film started going around, they had to believe because there it was in front
plain
of their
sight.
eyes. So it was really, the big breakthrough. And then gradually I got to know the chimps, their personalities,
Yeah.
how they differed from each other, could watch the maternal behavior and just, realize so much about them.
And that sort of research really hadn't been greatly examined in that time. Had it this whole thing of nurturing, and the fact that the nurturing was very similar to the human nurturing, and all these similarities that you brought in. It was always about the differences before then, and then you started bringing in the similarities. And I suppose the word anthropomorphism was thrown around, and that was very contentious at the time as well. And but I believe we can anthropomorphise because we are animals. There's this sort of separation.
Well, when I went to Cambridge, because Lewis told me I had to get a degree to stand on my own 2 feet, but he said there's no time to mess with a BA, you have to go straight for a PhD. I've got your place in Cambridge. I was the 8th person admitted without a preliminary degree.
Right. Wow.
And I was nervous, can you imagine?
Oh, I can't.
And to be told by these learned professors that I'd done everything wrong. I shouldn't have given the chimps names, they should have had numbers, that was science. And I couldn't talk about personality,
No.
couldn't talk about minds capable of solving problems,
No.
and certainly not emotions, happiness, sadness, fear, despair. But I luckily had a wonderful teacher when I was a child, and that teacher taught me in this respect the professors were wrong. And that teacher was my dog.
Right.
And we have 2 dogs
See,
here.
it's the dog.
So, and you know what was strange? Once I was standing. It was a very funny little, it was a podium about quarter this size, and it was about 20 people in the room, very rich house, and they had two Congolese hunting dogs that don't bark. And when I went in, they said, "We know you love dogs, but they're not fierce or anything, but they're just not interested in people, especially the male." So when I was just about to tell what I just said about Rusty, the male, and we got photo, he came up, he climbed onto the platform, and while I was talking about Rusty, he sat and looked out over the people, and then he walked away.
Yeah.
It was so strange. Very strange things have happened to me in my life.
Well, you've got the ability to connect, and I think that's a very powerful thing, and not everyone has that. So it's a very, it's your unique gift, and that translates to your relationship with other animals, as we've just seen. It's sort of, the dog has already come up to us, and I've seen that very powerful piece of footage of you going into, I'm not sure which forest it is, but you're releasing a chimpanzee that was in the sanctuary.
That was in Congo.
Yeah, and was it a chimpanzee that you knew before?
No, I'd never seen her till that day.
Really? I mean, it was such a powerful piece of footage and the beauty of film, isn't it? Because it showed this connection that you had with that chimpanzee, and it's also that chimpanzee trusted you immediately, and I found that really quite amazing.
What she's talking about, by the way, if you haven't seen that video, she comes up, we've taken her, the Congolese government have given us 3 beautiful islands on this big river, because in the sanctuary where we take in these orphan chimps whose mothers have been shot for bushmeat, they're wounded when they come in, and this chimpanzee by now is 9. She was one of the first to go onto this island, and she's in her traveling cage, and I hadn't met her before, and she comes out, and she goes up to Rebecca, who saved her life, the veterinarian, and she climbs onto the cage and sits there looking around, and she looks past me and then suddenly does a double take. She comes and she puts her arms around me, and she holds me in this long embrace, which is not a normal chimp embrace. They're usually quick. She just holds me, looks around holding me, and finally, after what seemed ages, I don't know how long it was actually.
Long moment.
And then she goes off into the forest. And now she's the dominant chimp of a group of 30. She's called Wunda, which means close to death in the local language. And 3 years ago, she was one of only 2 chimps whose birth control implant went wrong. So she had this little baby, and mother and child doing well, and we called that baby Hope.
Oh, right, beautiful.
So it was a very amazing video. You can get it on YouTube.
It's absolutely very powerful. That goes to the Jane Goodall Institute, which you started in the 70s, 1977, I think. Yeah. And that was, I think, from what I've read, for your way to move forward with your research, and also to conserve these environments for the chimpanzees and chimpanzee colonies.
Well, we started it because it was a vehicle in which so people could make donations.
Yes, of course.
You have a non-profit of some sort.
Non-profit organisation, and it was the thing I love about that is your understanding that communities involved around the areas that lived around the forest and in the forest were essential to preserving these environments. Would you like to?
That was a bit later.
Was it? Okay.
So that 77, the Jane Goodall Institute was started in the US.
Right.
And there's now 35 of them. There's one here in New Zealand. And so I was able to go back to Gombe. It's the best days of my life, out in the rainforest, understanding the interconnection of all living things, feeling the great spiritual connection with nature out in the forest. And I could have stayed there for the rest of my life. Money was coming in. I built up a research station after getting my PhD. It was better than anything I dreamed of as a child. But then at a conference in '86, I realized that all across Africa, chimpanzees were disappearing, forests were being cut down, human populations were growing, and everything changed at that conference. I went as a scientist and I left as an activist, but I didn't know what to do But anyway, I got a bit of money, went to 7 different countries in Africa where people by then were studying chimpanzees, learned a lot about the problems of the chimps. But that's when I realized that so many people living in and around chimp habitat were incredibly poor.
Yeah.
They didn't have good education and health facilities. And when I flew over the tiny Gombe National Park, where my research still continues, or our research, and it was part of the forest that stretched right across Africa when I began in '60. And by 1990, it was a minute island of forest surrounded by completely bare hills, more people living there than the land could support, too poor to buy food from elsewhere, farmland overused and infertile, and they were struggling to survive. And that's when it hit me. If we don't help the people to find ways of making a living without destroying the environment, then we can't even try to save the chimpanzees.
Right.
So that's when JGI began a program called Take Care, or Takari we call it. And it didn't start with a bunch of arrogant white people going into the 12 villages around Gombe and saying, oh, we're going to do this and this will make things better.
Yes.
No, it was a little hand-picked group of 7 local Tanzanians who went into the villages and asked the people, what do you think we can do to make your lives better? And that's where we began, growing more food, pushing the Tanzanian authorities to improve health and education. And then we could introduce water management, microcredit, so that groups of primarily women could take out tiny loans for environmentally sustainable projects, like a few chickens or a tree nursery. And scholarships, as many as we could afford, to keep girls in school during and after puberty, because it's been shown all around the world that as women's education improves, family size tends to drop. And finally, providing family planning information, again, by the local Tanzanians, not by us.
Yeah.
So we put on workshops for them. And they're so grateful, because they cannot afford these big families anymore. And so that project is now in 104 villages through the whole of the chimp range in Tanzania. And almost all of those chimps live in unprotected forests, village forest reserves. But now that the villagers understand that we're helping, they've provided volunteers who, even if they can't read or write, they can learn to use a smartphone.
Yeah.
And they proudly go into their forest and record illegally cut trees or animal traps or sighting a chimp or a leopard or a pangolin or something like that.
Wow.
And that all goes up to a platform on the clouds called Global Forest Watch.
Wow.
And to me it's amazing. I began
That
with
is
pencil
amazing.
and paper, and now we're using this, very cutting edge GIS, GPS, satellite imagery, drones,
Yeah.
things which were science fiction when I was
Yeah, of
young.
course.
And so that same sort of project is now in 6 other African countries.
Fantastic. It's
So there are forests and chimps who wouldn't be there if I hadn't gone to Gombe.
and
probably.
communities connected to their environment
Yes.
in a way that they may not have ever been connected before.
Well,
which is,
they now realize that protecting the environment isn't just to save wildlife, which was why will these white people come in, these
Yeah.
rich people,
Tell
and
us
save
what
the
to do.
wildlife and not care about us? Well,
Yes.
that wasn't the case, you see.
yeah.
And so they become our partners in conservation. So you fly over Gombe today, there aren't any more bare hills.
Right.
The trees have come back.
Wow. So that goes to the notion that I think when you're younger, you think the world is huge. We think we've got this massive world that's just incomprehensible how big it is, and it's endless. And the forests and our nature was endless, and it was, we could just do what we liked with it, basically. And like you, I started going to Borneo in the 1990s, and I've been going there predominantly for about 22 years. And I saw this incredible reduction in that forest in such a short time.
Oil palm plantations.
Oil palm, and all the animals being pushed into tiny corridors of a landscape, and just the horror of how quickly that happened, and that sudden realisation that the world is actually tiny, and we have done so much destruction in a tiny amount of time, a blink in the history of the world. But you're saying that it is regeneratable, like we can bring it back, which is what's an important message, I think, to say, because it's action now that has to happen for that to happen, and it's so essential as well.
Yeah, so all this work of saving the environment and helping people is useless unless the next generation becomes better stewards than we've been.
Yeah.
You know the saying, we haven't inherited this planet from our parents, we've borrowed it from our children,
Yeah.
but we've been stealing.
Yeah.
We're still stealing our children's future. And it was when I was traveling around the world and talking to young people, high school, university, in all the different continents, that I found they were losing hope.
Yeah.
They were depressed, they were angry, or mostly just apathetic. And when I began talking to them, it was always the same, that we've compromised their future and there's nothing they can do about it. But you see, I believe it's not too late.
No.
And that's why we began our youth program, Roots and Shoots, which is growing fast in New Zealand. And it's actually in 60 countries around the world, kindergarten, university, everything in between. And I think the reason it's growing so fast is we're not dictating to the young people. They get to choose what they're passionate about to make the world better. But between them, in a group, they've got to choose a project to help people, a project to help other animals, and a project to help the environment. And the main message is every single one of us makes an impact on the planet every single day.
Yeah.
And so it's become like it's a movement, and it's spreading fast. And it's also, which is really important, bringing together young people of different nations, cultures and religions, and helping them to understand that, you know, if we bleed, our blood is the same. If we cry, our tears are the same. If something makes us laugh, that wonderful feeling, our laughter is the same. And chimpanzees laugh too.
I know.
And chimpanzees and apes have a sense of humor. I think many other animals have a sense of humor too. And you know, this is why I brought Ratty, okay? Now, here in New Zealand, you call these creatures pests or vermin. Who brought them here? We did.
Yeah.
They weren't here originally. They don't want to be here particularly. But anyway, this is Ratty. And Ratty is a giant forest rat from Africa. And they have the same sense of smell and the same intelligence as the rats you know here. But they've been trained with their wonderful sense of smell to detect the explosive in a landmine deep under the ground. And they've been credited with playing a major part in making Mozambique landmine free. And I met so many people who'd lost feet working in the fields after the Civil War. And some of them have now been trained to sniff out ivory. And isn't it sad that New Zealand is one of the very, very few developed countries to have a trade in ivory? That some of them sniff out rhino horn, and the rhino horn apparently goes through New Zealand out to the east. And some of them sniff out pangolin scales. So these guys actually are highly intelligent. And then Piglet, Winnie the Pooh, right? Piglet, and I'm not going to tell you what you'll see, but please Google after this. Google, not Picasso the artist, but Pigcasso. Google Pigcasso, and you will be completely amazed and amused. It'll give you a great kick. Pigs are as intelligent as dogs.
I've had a pet peeve.
Yes, more intelligent than some dogs. And when I show people this video, Pigcasso, many of them have said, Jane, I wish you hadn't shown me that. I'll never eat bacon again.
They're such amazing. I had a pet pig, and it was he was Oscar, his name was, and he was so intelligent.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah. And I think
You must Google Pigcasso too.
Oh yeah, I will, definitely.
Yeah.
Love the idea of Picasso.
Yes, please.
Hello, Picasso.
This is the other problem you have in New Zealand. Yeah, right? Cows. And the cow travels with me everywhere now. I had her for about 5 or 6 years. She's a bit battered, but you know, because more and more people are eating more and more meat,
Yeah.
there's this horrific cruelty in the factory farms.
I know.
So, but some people don't seem to care. They seem to think that if we breed animals for meat, they don't have feelings. Absolutely untrue. There's a horrifying video of a cow escaping and chasing desperately after a truck that's taking her calf away to be killed. I mean, it's so sad to watch. And she collapses.
Right.
And, but you know, some people just don't care about that. But what about what they do to the environment? Areas of habitat have to be cleared to grow the grain, then masses of fossil fuel to take the grain to the animals to slaughter, meat to the table. And lots of water is used to change vegetable to animal protein. And in addition, I use cow when I talk to children especially, because it makes them giggle. Food goes in this end, gas comes out the other end.
Yeah.
And you know, that's just the process of digestion. And cows is particularly, they produce a lot of this gas because they also belch, they're ruminants. And that's methane. Everybody knows now that carbon dioxide, CO2, coming from burning fossil fuels, that's creating these greenhouse gases that surround the globe like a blanket and trap the heat of the sun. But methane is a very virulent one. And so it's our heavy meat eating that is adding hugely, and people don't think about that so much. I don't think people want to think about it.
Well, it's such a big change, I suppose, in the way we live. I know that the cattle farming in the Amazon is a very, very big problem in the rainforest.
It's the same in Tanzania.
Yeah.
It's the same everywhere.
And a lot of the cattle farming, which is causing this deforestation and this methane problem, is going into McDonald's and hamburger.
I've never been into a McDonald's in my entire life.
Yeah, you're not missing out on a lot.
No, I know.
You're not missing out on a lot.
Well, you know, when I stopped eating meat was late 60s. I read that book by philosopher Peter Singer called Animal Liberation.
To bring up Peter Singer. Yeah.
So I didn't know about factory farms. When I went to Gombe, they didn't exist in England. And so the next time I saw a bit of meat on my plate, I thought, this symbolizes fear, pain, death. I don't want to eat that.
Well, Peter Singer's an interesting person. I don't know if anyone's heard of Peter Singer. He's an Australian, I like to claim, from Monash, originally from Monash University, and he's now in America. But he's been writing books and trying to get legal rights for chimpanzees. Was the beginning of his legal rights for animals, but for chimpanzees. And it's a very interesting journey that he's gone on, isn't it? And I think there's been a lot of movement further recently in that. I don't know what's happened.
Yes,
with that.
Steve Wise
Right.
is a lawyer, and he spent the last 15 years working solely on getting these legal rights.
Yeah.
And I've testified a few times, trying to rescue individual chimpanzees from wayside zoos or circuses, and coming closer and closer.
Well, it definitely is making an impact, because I know at Monash, I had my own horrific story where my grandfather left all his money to Monash, to the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne for brain research, Alzheimer's research. Our family are very big animal rights advocates. He never left us any criteria for how that money was spent. And years later, the Monash University was given that endowment, and we were invited as a family to the Roet wing, which was this building that they built out of the money. And all around the room, they had photos of chimpanzees with electrodes coming out of their heads. And we were absolutely horrified that our whole family money had gone to this incredible situation. And I was doing all the work that I was doing. And I spoke to Professor Singer at the time, and I said, we can't have this is outrageous. And it was the beginning, well, it had already gone into motion, but they ended up taking away that money from that research, and they ended up freeing those chimpanzees that were being used, and very discreetly used. No one knew it was happening. So I think there are a lot of things moving forward with chimpanzees in that, and other animals, where they're not allowed anymore to be used for this horrendous research.
Well, when I went to that conference that changed my life, we had a session not only on conservation, it was mainly about chimp behaviour, but we had the conservation, but we also had situations in some captive conditions. And the one that really got to me, secretly filmed footage of chimps in these medical research labs. So our closest relatives who can live for 60 years, 5 foot by 5 foot cages. And so I didn't know what to do about that either, but first I had to get into the lab, because I really think you have to see a thing with your own eyes. You can't rely on somebody else's video. I don't know why they let me in, but they did. And you know, so the first lab I was let into, there was a male chimpanzee. He was about 30 years old. He was called Jojo. And to go into this lab, there were 6 chimps on this side of the room and 6 on the other, all in these tiny cages, all alone. Such social beings, but they were alone. They couldn't groom each other. And so I went down on my elbow to look into Jojo's eyes. Had to wear a mask, of course. And when I thought about the chimps in Gombe and I looked at him in this cement-floored cage, I mean, tears began trickling under my mask, and Jojo reached out a finger and gently moved the tears. And that's when I knew. So that was 1987, and that began this long battle, joined, of course, by other organizations. But 3 years ago, all of the 400 chimpanzees came out of medical research, the National Institutes of Health Medical Research, into sanctuaries.
And I think the incredible thing about that is for those 400 chimpanzees, obviously, but what it turns this mirror onto people, you know, where they start maybe seeing something that they hadn't seen before, even though it's in front of them. It takes another eye or another vision, and the power of observation, of your observation and presentation, for them to actually see what's going on, and that trickles down not just to chimpanzees, but to the whole way we are and the decisions that we make in life.
With cows and pigs.
Yeah, so this whole idea
rats.
really, and the forests and deforestation and essentially our way of being now, doesn't it? And that's what I'd like to thank you for opening those windows for all of us to be able to see, to be able to see.
The problem is the problems are now so major.
Yeah.
And you know that the similarities between us chimpanzees, gorillas, are striking. We share 98.6% of our DNA composition with chimpanzees. And I talk a lot about the similarities: kissing, embracing, holding hands, patting, long-term family bonds, male dominance, males competing with each other, swaggering, shaking their fists, bunching their lips furiously. And they remind me of some male politicians. Oh, yes, they do. And so, but there's a difference. I mean, you don't get a group of chimpanzees sitting and listening to people talking. Sometimes I think they're wise, but anyway. So the biggest difference, we developed this way of speaking with words. So for the first time, we can tell our children about things that aren't present, and we can bring people together to discuss problems. And I think that's triggered this explosive development of our intellect. I mean, just think, we sent a rocket to Mars.
Exactly.
Photographs of the surface of the red planet.
The first animal that America sent was a chimpanzee.
Ham. Yeah, Ham. But he didn't go to the moon.
No.
He only went into space.
Yeah.
Yes, I got photographs of the way those chimps were trained.
Yeah.
And the astronauts, I met the first astronauts, and they said we couldn't have gone through that training.
No. Well, Ham received 10 times the G-force that any person. There was an electronic problem in the flight.
But also his capsule went wrong and plunged into the ocean.
Yes. I mean, it was a terrifying journey.
It was awful.
There's footage where they open the capsule and the commentator goes, "Ham's had a great journey. Look at the smile on his face." And Ham's got this grin of fear.
It's the worst fear I've ever seen.
Yeah, I know. And this person thought it was a grin of laughter.
Well, that message got around.
Yeah.
And so the people were desperate to prove that the chimp was happy. And so they got a big press conference. Stupid they were, but anyway. So they got the capsule and they brought Ham out. And he'd been so well trained, he had to go into the capsule. But 4 men couldn't get him in.
Yeah.
That's how scared he was.
Yeah, of course.
So you know, so, but anyway, we did that.
Yeah.
Look at the moon next time and think of the awe. We got people walking on the moon. I mean,
It's incredible.
so how is it possible that the most intellectual creature to ever walk the planet is destroying its only home? And there seems to be a disconnect between the brain and the heart, love and compassion. And I truly believe only when
Empathy.
head and heart work in harmony can we attain our true human potential.
Yeah.
I mean, we've dissociated ourselves from nature, and we've got this materialistic way of thinking, and it's got so bad that every time it's the environment up against a business proposition, you know, destroying the environment for some kind of new shopping mall, 9 times out of 10 or more, the environment loses out and money wins. And there's corruption too. So the four things we have to deal with. 1, alleviate poverty, because when you're really poor you can't make the right decisions in how you live. You just have to get by somehow.
Yeah.
Secondly, the unsustainable lifestyle we all have. We have to try and leave lighter footprints and think about the consequences of what we buy, how it was made, did it hurt the environment, cruelty to animals, child slave labor, is that why it's cheap? And then the subject that people shy away from, it's human population growth. And we have to think about that. Isn't it crazy to think on a planet with finite natural resources, we can, treat them as though they're infinite, that we can have unlimited economic development in the same old way that we're doing it now, with a growing population. It's going to collapse. There is no question, if we carry on as we are now, our great-grandchildren will not have a future on this planet.
Yeah, and I think that's what the United Nations Climate Summit, which was only several weeks ago, was talking about, that this is happening a lot quicker than...
Yeah, we've been talking about this for years.
I know, it must be very frustrating.
It's
for you
very
because
frustrating.
For 30 years you have been talking about it,
Yeah.
and it's only now that people... I mean, in Australia, it was only now, last week, that people started talking about it, and we thought we'd done something, and it ended up being a fight between a coal mine and the environment. It literally came down to that, and it was devastating.
Or a dam.
Yeah, or a dam, or...
Yeah.
And it's the future, our children, so it's important that all of us with our children and grandchildren support them the way that your mother supported you and the way my mother supported me, to start making those decisions, to sort of make decisions.
It's usually the other way around. The kids are changing their parents. That's how it's working. And sometimes the parents are CEOs, sometimes they're in government.
Yeah.
So as the kids get to
It's
understand.
true, actually, yes, it's true,
Yeah.
with the plastic bags.
Yes, plastic bags and all those things. Yeah.
Changing the sort of last several generations of greed. Has anyone got any questions that would like to ask Dr. Goodall?
Dr. Goodall, first, thank you. Secondly, it seems now that there are a lot more hominids than we thought. Did you ever think about the winnowing of those down to the very small, I think you said 5 species, and how the chimpanzees sort of survived in the 5 million years that they were around when so many others didn't?
I don't think I completely understand.
So what was the, could you rephrase the question?
The question is, there were a lot of hominids that died out in the 5 million years between chimpanzees evolving and today. Did you ever think at all about why the chimpanzees weren't one of those species that died out, and
how did the chimpanzees survive?
Well, Louis Leakey actually sent me out there because he spent his life searching for the fossilized remains of early humans. And he believed, as has now been proved true, that about 6 million years ago there was a common ancestor, ape-like, human-like. And from that common ancestor, the great apes, apart from us, branched off. And the other direction was us. Leakey wanted me to go because he felt that if Jane finds behavior similar or even the same in chimps and humans, then maybe that was also present in the early humans whose fossils he was searching for, and that might give him for the first time a way of imagining how they might have behaved. So that's why he sent me. Why we branched off in these different directions, I don't think anybody really knows. Habitat changing, who knows? But you know, it's thought that when humans left the forest and moved into the savanna, that's when we began to really change. But I don't think anybody knows.
I've got a question for you, which a primatologist once told me, but I'm not sure if it's true. Chimpanzees and humans are closer genetically to each other than a gorilla is to a chimpanzee. So that just shows how close we are as on the tree of life. But we share the same blood types as chimpanzees, and I think chimpanzees have got extra blood types as well. Is it possible to have a blood transfusion between a human and a chimpanzee?
I don't think it is.
Right.
And the reason that the chimps were removed from medical research by the National Institutes of Health was amazing. I luckily met the current director of NIH, Francis Collins, at a dinner, and he'd only been in that position for about 3 weeks. And so, of course, I started talking to him about the chimps. And he said, Jane, I'm a geneticist. He's the one who unraveled the human genome.
Right.
And so he said, I don't know about chimps. I spent the rest of dinner telling him.
Yeah.
So he put together a little group of 11 NIH scientists, and we added 2 welfare people. And they spent 18 months examining every single experiment being done on the 400 chimpanzees that they owned. And this team was asked 2 questions. Is the experiment beneficial to human health? Is it potentially beneficial to human health? And the answer came back 0. Neither beneficial nor potentially beneficial. So that's when Francis Collins said, right out to a sanctuary. And there were a lot of people in NIH who were furious with him and fought and said, but you never know, they might be useful in the future. And the bill nearly didn't go through, but it did in the end. So thank you, Francis, for listening.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jane, we're so privileged to have you here, and so grateful for your enduring, endless commitment to conservation. Recent troubling news, for instance, the return of more whaling in Japan.
Oh yes, awful.
And only last week, the proposed lifting on the ban of elephant hunting in Botswana.
It's 6 African countries now want to open up elephant hunting.
So how can we be more effective in stopping this tide of backward steps?
Well,
It
it's
seems to be more and more and more.
I don't know. I mean, we just have to not give up. That's the main thing. We just have to not give up. You know, I was just reading a book about Britain in the war, and Hitler trying to bomb Britain into submission with the Blitz. And because people wouldn't give up, in the end they came out, lots more people died. But you know, it's what I call the indomitable human spirit, the people who tackle what seems impossible and won't give up. And this is why I carry Mr. H, because he was given to me by one of these people who have this indomitable spirit. And his name is Gary Horn, that's why this is Mr. H. And he gave him to me 29 years ago. And Gary Horn went blind when he was 21 in the US Marines, decided to become a magician. Everybody laughed and said, Gary, how can you be a magician if you can't see? The children don't know he's blind. And at the end he'll tell them and he'll say, you know, something may go wrong in your life because we never know, but if it does, don't give up. There's always a way forward. And he does cross-country skiing, he does skydiving, And I think most amazingly, and I think you'll be interested in this, he's taught himself to paint. He never painted before.
Without seeing.
And he's done a book, and you can get it from Amazon. It's just a little book.
Yeah.
It's called Blind Artist by Gary Horn.
Okay.
And it's H-A-U-N, like a fawn, not H-O-R-N, H-A-U-N.
H-A-U-N.
And there's a portrait of Mr. H. Now, he's never seen Mr. H.
Really?
He's only felt him.
Wow.
And of course, he has to have help with getting the right color.
Mm.
And as he went blind at 21, he can remember colors.
Yeah.
So if people tell him Mr. H is grey, then he has to have somebody to find the grey.
Yeah.
But apart from that, and in the book it explains how he does it. It's amazing.
Very interesting. I'll definitely get that.
Yeah. And so, you know, those are my reasons for hope. The youth of today, the amazing human brain. If we can get to the moon and photograph Mars, if we get together, surely we can solve some of these problems. And our intellect is beginning with, you know, some of the clean green energy, for example, which if governments would support the clean green energy instead of kowtowing to the wealthy oil and gas people, we would be off the grid. There's no question.
Look at Australia, the resources that we have.
Yes.
And we're still opening up.
And what
coal
about
mines.
Tanzania? They're just making a huge dam because of our wonderful new president. It's in a World Heritage Site. It's the biggest protected area in Tanzania, and now already thousands of trees have gone ready to build the dam. He won't listen. He said, anybody who opposes the dam will suffer the consequences. That's nice, isn't it,
Yeah.
for your president? But anyway, we are coming up with these ways, and as individuals, we can use our brain to try and lighten our ecological footprint. And then there's the resilience of nature, animal species rescued from the brink of extinction. Lots of amazing examples in New Zealand. And again, can't we, if we really try and get together the right people, not in a huge conference, but a small working group, can't we find a way to get to have the rats and the stoats and the possums leave without using 1080? And can't we find another way?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then finally, you know, my last reason for hope is the indomitable human spirit.
Yeah.
And we mustn't give up. And I say, okay, we have to work with the children and keep them having hope, because without hope you give up. And then eventually these monsters who are ruling countries and destroying the environment, they will gradually disappear because they'll get old and die. We must have the next generations ready to leap in. And already we've got the environment minister in Tanzania who is standing up to this president.
Oh, really?
He was in Roots and Shoots in primary
really
school.
fantastic.
The environment minister in DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, he was in Roots and Shoots. And when I'm going around China, people come up and say, but of course I care about the environment. I was in Roots and Shoots in primary school. So, you know, they are now, because we began in 91, they're coming up into these positions. And we just have to pray for a critical mass of young people who understand the problems, who understand the danger if we carry on like this.
Just on the subject of the future generation, I'm a mother of 2 girls, and I try really hard to raise them with a strong environmental consciousness, but also a real awareness of what they can do in their daily lives to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And my 6-year-old in particular really gets it to the extent where recently she refused to use a bucket of space.
We should give her a mic because nobody can hear.
Sorry, can you hear me, Jane? Or do you
I
want
can,
me to-
yeah, but nobody else
and
can.
so my 6-year-old in particular gets it, and recently she refused to use a bucket and spade at the beach because she said, Mummy, I'm not taking that near the beach, it's plastic and it's bad for our oceans and you can't make me use it. And I said, no problem. And so I want to do as much as I can to encourage that consciousness and awareness that is already embedded in her little 6-year-old brain. And I've purchased one of your books, Jane, to give her next week for her birthday. And what I'd just like to know from you is, if you had young children that you wanted to raise to be part of that future solution rather than problem, what is the single most important message that you seek to pass on to them and teach them?
you trailed off at the end.
What's the
If I had children, what would I do?
What's the single most important message that you would seek to pass on to your children to ensure that they are part of the solution rather than part of the problem?
I would get them involved in Roots and Shoots.
Roots and Shoots.
I mean, seriously, that's
Yeah.
not a joke.
How do you bring it into schools? Because that's something I'd be interested in doing.
Well, and you can talk to Melanie, who's here. There she
Yes.
is. She's CEO of Roots and, of JGI in New Zealand. And, you know, if your 6-year-old gets involved in Roots and Shoots, and we begin in kindergarten, well, actually, we begin in primary school, and then she's with young people who feel like she does, with a teacher, because you have to have a teacher supporting, or a mother like you. It could be, I mean, you could start a group. Anybody can start a group. We like to have them registered because we can share their projects. But you can start a group just because you care. And there's websites, and there'll be a digital platform and all these things. And so then your daughter will be part of a global family of people who care.
Jane, thank you for your words. You mentioned protected areas earlier, and I wondered what your views are on greater protection for both land and ocean, and global campaigns like 30 by 30, and what your views are there.
I can't, did you hear that?
Thank you for your words, Jane. You mentioned protected areas early, and I was interested in your thoughts on global campaigns like 30 by 30 and the need for greater protection of both our land and our ocean. Do you think that we need greater protection for both land and ocean?
Oh, definitely. I mean, of course
Yeah.
we do. Where, you know, how crazy is it to think that it's good for either the land or us to sprinkle chemical poison on the agricultural land? It gets washed down into the rivers, it ends up in the ocean. It's causing the acidification of huge areas of ocean, so that the forests and the ocean are the two great lungs of the world. They absorb carbon dioxide and they give out oxygen. But the ocean is losing its ability to be one of those lungs. And as the forests disappear, they too, not only can they no longer absorb CO2 because they're not there to do it, but as they're cut down, especially when they're burned, all the CO2 goes back into the atmosphere and it's released from the forest soils as well. So, yeah, we've got to protect the land, we've got to protect the ocean, and in different countries and in different parts of the same country, we need different methods. But we've got to change attitudes. We cannot go on with this intensive agriculture, this industrial agriculture, where there's monocultures, where the soil is getting destroyed deeper and deeper. And we need all those little organisms in the soil which haven't as yet been, I mean, people are only just beginning to find out the richness of life under the soil or in the depths of the ocean. And we're destroying those things. That's the underpinning of our life. You know, we depend on the natural world. And then perhaps the last story, which is the last message, a good message, I think. And it's about a chimpanzee who'd been in medical research. He was brought from Africa, aged about 1.5, and endured 14 years in a small cage. And then, lucky for him, he wasn't wanted anymore, and he was put in on a man-made island in a zoo in Florida. Lion Country Safari, I know it well. And with him on the island were 3 females, also from medical research. And a young man was employed to look after them, and he was told, don't go anywhere near them, they're much stronger than you, they hate people, they'll try to kill you. So he's got a little paddle boat and he throws the food on the island. But after a year or so, he's become increasingly fascinated by their behavior. And a baby is born. This male I'm talking about was named Old Man, even though he was only 2 when he arrived in the lab. Because when a baby chimp is frightened and depressed, they huddle over and they look like little old men. And so Old Man obviously sired this baby. It's quite amazing, really, because usually they don't know how to behave. But
Yeah.
anyway, he did. And Mark watched and saw how Old Man loved this baby and shared his food and carried him around. And he thought, if I don't have a better relationship with these chimps, how can I properly look after them? So he began going a bit closer and a bit closer. One day he held out a banana. An Old Man took it from his hand and he said, Jane, I know how you felt when David Greybeard first took a banana from you. And one day he dared step onto the island and nothing happened. And one day he approached Old Man and started to groom him. And after a bit, Old Man turned and groomed him back.
Oh.
And a little later, he actually played tickling Old Man in his ticklish neck, and Old Man started to laugh. So Old Man accepted him. The three females kept away, but they didn't hurt him, until one day he slipped, been raining, and fell flat on his face, and unfortunately the infant, who was by then 2, was close by, screamed in fear, and so the mother, of course, thought Mark had hurt the child, rushed over, bit into his neck as he lay on the ground, and the other 2 females rushed to help their friend. One bit his hand, his wrist, and one bit his leg.
Yeah.
And he's lying there thinking, how am I going to escape? He looks up and here's Old Man thundering across the island with his hair bristling, his lips bunched in a furious scowl. And Mark thought, he thinks I've hurt his precious child. And he prepared to die, because chimps are 8 times stronger than we are. But what did Old Man do? Physically pulled those 3 females away and kept them at bay while Mark dragged himself to the boat and said. So I met Mark when he came out of hospital, and he said, Jane, no question, Old Man saved my life. And so I think if a chimpanzee and one who's been so terribly abused by people can reach out to help a human in time of need, then surely we, with our greater capacity for understanding and compassion, can do the same for the animals. And their time of need is great. We can all do our bit.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you so much.